A couple of the big themes that came through for me was obviously this ongoing discussion around, is human rights impact assessment, can that be covered in a really good social impact assessment, or that other piece around the integrated impact assessment. So, these are just the questions, and these are some of the themes that are sort of coming up. I think I certainly feel more comfortable with the response to that, but let's hear how the panel will address some of those questions and how they'll challenge each other as well. And following on from that, there was a little bit of talk around the challenges around another assessment. Now, I think this is primarily coming from this theme around the education of human rights impact assessment, and also this whole notion of impact assessment and integrated impact assessment. And there's lots of other themes going on around, how many impact assessments, and is it something that we do to provide information, we heard from Richard in particular, versus something that will influence and inform the decision making. So I think this whole human rights piece is certainly a driver in a lot of that, because it's so much more complex, and what I feel is a lot more complex around this language of rights-based, and seeing the work through the lens of a rights-based, which is a very different language to the conventional sort of practitioner language of impact assessment. So I think that's really interesting. This notion of the positives that it can bring, this reframed or this different approach, how much of a positive impact that it will bring. So it's not just, and we sort of fall into this trap with any sort of impact assessment where we're always looking at the risks rather than the opportunities. So it's not just about risk mitigation, but also enhancing opportunities. So what the impact of that is. And for me, and I hope I did get engrossed. I did warn the panel that I would be very strict on timing, but of course I got so engrossed in the presentations that I completely forgot about the timing towards the end. So much for that. But one recurring notion that kept emerging for me, particularly around the stakeholder and the engaging with the communities, and Susan really brought it out in the way that she talked about the example with the mine around engaging with the local communities, but these notions of trust and understanding and how to build that around these kind of practices, because of course if there's no trust, particularly in the context of human rights, how effective can it be? So I don't know whether that's something that we can also touch on in the discussions. So with that, these are just a very quick snapshot that I copied down as we had a quick break of some of the things. I'm sure whoever was here will think of a lot more. I've certainly got some questions from the audience previously that I'll also be sharing with the panel. And with that, I'll just do another quick introduction of the panel. The details I can pronounce the names correctly. So first off, we have Catherine Gotto-Walton, who's with Synergy Globus, and we have Susan Joyce, who's with On Common Ground. We have Richard Wale, who's from Banana, and we have Michelle Brown from CSR Asia, Alison Hall from Business for Social Responsibility. We have Mark Wilger from Newfields, who's in the middle there, and we have two new panellists. I got that right, yes. We have two new panellists, as in members of the roundtable that I'll introduce. We've got Alan Jorgensen from the Danish Institute of Human Rights, and we have my colleague, Bert Foppemer from Shell Development Corporation, who's our Human Rights Implementation Manager. So before we move on, I'd like Alan and Bert to share a few words and perspectives. I'll sat through the panel session. I'll share their roles and then also their perspectives from the panel, and I'll let them take over now. So perhaps, Alan, if you wanted to kick off.
Sure. Just to say a few words of introduction about why I'm here. I'm Director for Human Rights and Business at the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and we've been working in that particular field of human rights for more than a decade. So we've been following this field evolve to the kind of juncture, kind of seismic juncture that we're at right now, where different worlds are starting to come together. And obviously, one of the our role is partly tool maker, tool tester. We're behind some of the indicator tools that have been mentioned by different people here, large and small. Quick and longer. Sorry about that. But we do also take our own medicine, and we take very seriously to actually test and develop everything we do together with companies, and that's also how those tools converge, and we're continuing to do that in this impact assessment space also. One of the key things that is happening right now, of course, is that we're in year 1 after the rugby. There's a lot of noise, and there's a lot of fuss, and now we're starting to see, hopefully, the rubber hitting the road. There will be many interpretive discussions around, when have you actually had meaningful consultation? Because that's how the guiding principles talk about participation and inclusiveness. What does that mean? And it's our job to try and clarify that for companies and industries. But I would just maybe take a step back and say a word of caution. The guiding principles, they talk about assessing human rights impact. They don't talk about doing human rights impact assessment. And I think, just to get things in perspective, most companies don't do impact assessment. They may assess the risks and impacts, but most companies don't do an impact assessment in the way that we understand it as a particular professional exercise that you do with a consultant, where you do develop terms of reference, and it's done according to the standard that IAIA is part of setting up. So most companies, human rights due diligence would not even sort of come to this place. So that's just a kind of just to take a step back and stay true to what the guiding principles say on business and human rights. They talk about assessing human rights impact, not doing impact assessment. And I realize that maybe more difficult sell for consultants, but we'll work it out, I'm sure.
We've got a whole panel here to talk about it.
and another, maybe from the point of view of a human rights organization, a person coming from a human rights organization, what I can say to maybe be a little bit provocative is, don't do human rights impact assessment. We believe that 95% of human rights impact assessments will be done and should be done in the context of environmental and social impact assessments. I'm saying that echoing what you have said, also from an effectiveness point of view, but also from the point of view that even social impact assessment is not fully mature yet. There are capacity issues there as well. So we need to focus also on doing existing things well, rather than leapfrogging to a whole new paradigm. And I echo very much what Bruce Harvey said in the quote that you put out there about, you do a conflict impact assessment, then you do a health impact assessment. So you need to integrate things for it to become effective. And there are plenty of reasons why you could say existing impact assessments can be improved in so many ways that will also help human rights, even without being a human rights impact assessment. And one of the main opportunities for that are in this building today, and that's the capacity of the people doing it. And so I think that's why I'm also glad to be here. So I'll start with that.
Yes, I'm Wherefore come out from Shell. I work in the Hague, our corporate head office. I'm the coordinator for our human rights implementation program. And the reason that I'm here, kind of together with Ellen, is that we would like to explore more with the impact community, impact assessment community, as I hope you are here in the audience, how we start to mainstream the whole issue of human rights. When I got my job at Shell to work on human rights and implementation in particular, people immediately said, okay, fair enough, but don't start anything new, work on existing systems, and please make it normal. So I've actually got a job to do to tweak existing systems, to identify what we already do, and then tell everybody that that is what we do to implement the guiding principles. Now, that is kind of easy and difficult at the same time. But what I'm sure of is that it is multifunctional, so I can't do it on my own, I can't do it from the corporate headquarters and global lighting. Assessing impacts, like Alan says, is not a human rights impact assessment. It comes in different disguises. The people that work within HR, in human resources, do a different type of impact assessment than the people who work in companies, procurement, or security, or community work. So it is cross-functional. But I think for the purpose of the conversation today, I would be really interested to connect with you on, yes, social impact assessment. How can we bring social impact assessment as close as possible to human rights impact assessment? I don't have the illusion that it will work everywhere or under all circumstances, but I think social impact assessment would certainly work with projects. So kind of setting aside existing operations for a moment. I think it would really work in 80% of the circumstances, countries, issues, but it wouldn't work in maybe 20%. Maybe if you go to DRC and you have to see mining and all kinds of other stuff, you will not be good enough with your default social impact assessment. But let's see how we can mainstream and make wall-to-wall coverage of human rights impact assessment through SIAs in most of our operations. Now that's not my idea, it's actually a much broader idea. We are working in Shell, but in Shell we cooperate under AIAIA, the oil and gas industry group for social and environmental issues. And we have quite an active human rights implementation program in that group. All the majors are engaged, everybody seems to be usually together on the subject. And the Danish Institute is our consultant, particularly on this piece of work where we want to see how we mainstream human rights into social impact assessments for, let's say, normal circumstances. And I think what Ellen and I here are today are, I think we're the drivers of the omnibus from the quote here on the screen earlier today. But we're looking for passengers. We're looking for passengers to work with us on three things. On how do you decide when your normal social impact assessment is enough? Or when do you need to do, not a human rights impact assessment, I think we're going to call it a deep dive. There are many situations in impact assessment where you say, we need to look a little bit deeper. So how do you make the decision to be more than normal? The second thing we'd like to work on is something to do with prioritization, but that was a dirty word we understand from our American colleagues, because they say you can't prioritize impacts, they're all equally important. So we landed on measuring. How do you measure impacts? And it's important because in the guiding principles there are several times where they say you need to respond proportionally to the severity of the impact. Severity means measuring some kind of scale. So we'd like to work on that. And the final thing is around, and this comes to process of impact assessment, about engagement. How do you recognize vulnerable groups, marginalized groups, and do gender analysis? And what is then the special communication need for those marginalized groups? And the background behind that particular piece of work is that for my engagement with human rights NGOs, I've learned that it's really important to get the flow of information back to the to be transparent about potential impacts to get a stakeholder input. And with that piece of work, we want to make sure that we do get complete coverage of the impact people in the impact assessment process. So we're out here to discuss with you on all the issues you've already raised. I think we're very aligned. We do also like to take it one step further and actually move forward into solution mode rather than just having feedback mode.
Great, thank you very much. So note, we have the one corporate representative here on human rights implementation. So with that, I'd like to perhaps ask the panel to I guess, start engaging in some of the dialogue initially. I know that's already sort of started, as I said, in our informal area, but if nobody minds, another area that I'm interested in, and particularly around this human rights experience, and Susan sort of, alluded to it around this sort of expertise, like who's an expert in human rights. And maybe if we kick off with that, because I think that's kind of really relevant, because we all sort of come into it, and this is the next. I feel like this is another piece to it, but where are we all coming from? And do we need people who are experienced in human rights, or is it people who are experienced in processes and how to integrate it? Or people experienced in impact assessment and they know how to integrate the different themes and the subject matters? I don't know. So I'd be interested to hear from the panel, perhaps as a kick-off, if anybody's got a view on that. Can you tell me your views?
Where I do have a thought about that, and where I thought about it in relationship to some of the recommendations from the Marlin Mine, is that there's a tension between internal and external processes, and and this is just not from that one experience, but rather across the board. If a company doesn't own it, if it's not really integrated and coherent relative to how they work, and if they're not part of developing it and they understand how it relates to the rest of what they do, it's never going to move ahead. And this is the same for social monitoring and other aspects of the management performance. But you have to have the expertise to be able to identify what the human rights are, and that is very rarely existing in the companies, with some exceptions. So I think it's the combined effort, it's the collaborative effort between the specific expert who can say, well, that is in fact infringing on a right if, X, going beyond, for example, environment going beyond technical capacity to actually the issue of how communities will fear impacts to their water and what that will do to their well-being in the long term. It's not a technical issue, it's a question of their rights to have information, but to also be comfortable that their right to water is assured. So you're not going to have that recognition necessarily in the company. So the human rights expertise, I think, is critical to train and to bring that perspective, but ideally to transfer that expertise into the company as well.
I was just going to add one comment, not so much on the expertise side, but perhaps like SIA or like other elements of impact assessment. I think that the fundamental importance is around the listening skills within the company, and moving from this idea of consulting and sort of disclosing to real engagements and taking the time to listen, and that's probably where that skill comes in.
It's not the lawyers. What we're seeing right now is the creation of expertise, and I think we heard some people today that have expertise because they learned it on the ground, on the job. There isn't a cadre of corporate human right people with PhDs that you can go hire, because academia is not organized to deal with this topic. It's a cross-disciplinary topic when you look at it in terms of academia. Who is it? Sociologists? Business schools? There's business school textbooks on it and classes on it. Law schools? There's beginning to be law school classes on it. Where is it? There's a fight going on, a tug of war on the academic side. And here, what we've had to deal with is learning on the job, on the ground, how to do it. And I would propose that the best people to do it are the ones who have expertise in impact assessment, per se. Are used to going in the field and understanding a sequence of the field. And then you become an expert by looking through the human rights lens. That's a term that a number of people use. Looking through that lens gives you an eye for what human rights means on the ground. And that's where the experts will come from.
Can I just add something to those? Last year I've hired 2 people who did undergraduate degrees, one in environment and resource management, and then she went and did a master's in human rights. And in that, it's this incredible structured learning that took me best part of 19 years to pull together from on-the-ground experience. So I just wanted to temper that with, but it's changing really quickly, particularly if I look at something like the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining as well at the University of Queensland. The speed, I guess, with which academia is responding to that need is remarkable at the moment. And I guess that work has actually already got significant partners in Latin America. And where's the other one? It's Latin America and... Yeah, I'm looking at you because you're from the centre. This is the big plug for you. So there's a partner in our university in Santiago in Chile, which is also delivering training. Peru as well. So I guess when you ask and you look for it, it's actually probably remarkable what is already emerging.
Yeah, I would say emerging. I'm working with 2 masters in human rights and 1 PhD candidate. But they're kids. They're young. They're new. It's just coming.
I'm also very interested in what happens when we leave. So what is the knowledge that we unlock inside the company or inside the community that they can actually work with on a day-to-day basis? So I'm very much on the same page as saying it's about helping people articulate what they already know in perhaps a slightly new context. If you go in and have an internal process in a company like Shell with social performance people, contracting people, communities people, security people, they know an awful lot. It's just not being unlocked. And you can have the same in a community setting. So we're more facilitators, and we need to think about what happens when we sort of parachute into the next project. And that's where things need to stand the test.
Just a couple of thoughts while in this conversation. I wonder if this is a slight sort of deja vu with when social impact assessment started coming to the fore, and then there was this lack of capacity, or lack of knowledge of how to sort of do this on the ground, and I think that has moved on, and I wonder if human rights is following a similar pattern. The second point was actually more of a question to the panel, which has come from Alan, so noted by Alan's thoughts. In the work that you've already been doing, we talked about education and building awareness within the companies, so that then they can understand engagement dialogue. I wondered how much there was also a role to help the community engage in this understanding as well as the government. It's kind of in a way, in all of our presentations so far, I felt a little bit that the government is the kind of hairy elephant in the room. We haven't really talked about their role in all of this and how much they're engaging in this way. Did anybody want to answer that one?
I would like to hear what
Was that to Anne? Okay, so seeing as the panel's not going to respond to that one, I'll open to the floor. I also had some questions from the previous session which I'll go through, but we have some people who are ready to engage with the floor, so perhaps if we...
I would like to provoke a little panel. Because the only thing that I haven't heard is that you need a local expert or local person that can guide you. I have never done a human rights impact assessment. I have done social impact assessment and environmental impact assessment, and I will never dare to do it without having a local expert or a local person at my side, explaining the context, helping me to decode what is going on. So, can you do a human rights impact assessment without working together with a local person? And it's not community consultation, to having somebody who speaks the language, who has lived it, and having the skin. Can you do it, or do you dare doing it?
No, I would never do it without a local expertise. And local expertise that I work with is usually something academic, somebody in country or in region. Human rights is notorious for being polarized, and so the key would be to have a local person with expertise but without bias. But the short answer for me is no. You absolutely need that.
That's also a short answer for us. We often start with the primary local person being from the company. So as I said, we assign or we ask them to dedicate someone's time to be the lead, the site lead for human rights impact assessment. Obviously, they have a biased understanding of the company, but that's useful. If they're from the community, they can translate the local context. They can also translate the site context versus the corporate context. That said, in certain circumstances, we also partner with a local organization. Not often necessarily academic, but a local organization independent of the company if required. But definitely you have to have, as I think we all said, the country and the local knowledge. And you can't gain that from sitting at your desk in Canada or San Francisco.
Just a short answer, no.
I just wanted to tie it back with the previous question around building capacity, leading legacy. Is the two guys here in the Republic of Congo who work for me today, and they're there today probably sweating what we're talking about, right? Because they're facilitating a team-based risk assessment, cross-departmental team-based risk assessment on human rights. My one instruction was, because they were like, oh my God, Republic of Congo, the company's people's capacity knowledge of human rights was probably less than 0. And I said, in that team, there'll be one person who wants to be the champion for this going forward. There's nothing else we do today. It's give space, give permission to that one person. Right? And that's what I think is important, is that when we're catalysing this, we're building, whether that's a local person, being part of the team, or whether we're engaging, particularly as consultants, that's that change agenda, is it will only be a lasting impact in terms of that site's growing respect for local people's human rights, if those people understand it or making the decisions themselves. So, does that bring it all together? Yeah.
I was saying to that, but...
Thank you for the permission to answer that one.
Yeah, Nonita Yap from the University of Guelph, Canada. First of all, I want to thank the presenters. I was surprised. It was a very candid presentation, and I learned a lot. In fact, I will pick up the suggestion of the last speaker, this previous discussion, that I will actually, in my next year's IAIA course, I will use a right-based approach. I will actually use a human rights framework to introduce IAIA. I think it was very stimulating. Anyway, I want to pick up on some of the comments, on some of the conclusions shared by my understanding from the presenters. One is the emphasis on knowledge and expertise. The idea or the suggestion that the main challenge is just to make the company understand human rights and understand, it's beyond understanding. They have to recognize, not only is that they have to recognize human rights, they have to recognize the community's right to say no to development. And so ultimately, the test of Ashanti Gold, of Shell, their commitment, public commitment to FPIC is whether they will accept the community's right to say, no, we are not ready for this. Which in Mackenzie Valley, 30 years ago, Berger did. Berger said, I consulted for 2 years with regional communities, and the theme keeps on coming back. We don't understand the white culture. We are not ready for development. So what did Berger do? Impose a 10-year moratorium. And so now, yes, we have a Mackenzie Valley pipeline, and it is very well accepted by most of the Aborigines. So again, ultimately, will Shell, will Ashanti Gold, will say, yes, if you say no, we will pause, we will retreat. Instead, we're looking for the right process. We can only find the right process, and the right framework, and the right tool will get there. I think we have to develop humility. Not just the company, but also the consultants. We have to develop humility. And so, somebody also said something about context, and I agree, context is important. But in the end, there has to be a bottom line level principle. And so I was glad when some of the speakers mentioned water. The need for water is a human right. And regardless of how many jobs the community has, that company has provided, if they deprive drinking water, that is deadly. That's not sustainable. Even if they trap in water. But what when they close down? Who will provide drinking water? So there has to be some, if you want, universal bottom line. And I have to comment on the context. Two of you actually mentioned that we need to join forces and the need for comprehensive information, and if only we can have information. I'm speaking as an academic. I have 2 students, grad students who are believers in CSR, okay? Great believers. Well, there is a book published in Canada exposing the human rights violation of a Canadian mining company. And the mining company, which got an award, CSR award from the Canadian Mining Association, sued the publisher of the book for millions of dollars, for libel. Fortunately, the court ruled against it. But there's an intimidation against research. If it's research that is not done by consultants, but research done by academics, the federal government of Canada has a CSR policy. The unit in Foreign Affairs refused to talk to my students. And you know, in this country that I shall not mention, FPIC is enshrined in the Mining Act. But you know, 700 people have been killed in the last few years, mostly anti-mining. And don't tell me, please, that it's misinformation. We had a guest last year that couldn't even answer any question on mining because he just received information his bishop had been assassinated. I cannot send students to mining communities. So I agree, and I'm glad that we have progressed far, I think, but there are some real struggles, I think, that we shouldn't lose hope.
Okay, there's some fairly meaty themes in there. I really hope somebody's going to take the time to respond to those.
I think you're probably spot on, and it is something that kind of wakes me up every now and then, whether it's a big elephant in the room, because my work is trying to make human rights normal, so I have to look at what our company does in terms of systems and processes and policies, and see how we can integrate human rights in a way that actually is done. But there's always two approaches. You can do something new and separate, that is run by dedicated people who are really expert, but normally it doesn't really ground, it doesn't go anywhere. So we choose the other approach, integration. But then integration, and you explain certain things that apparently don't always work well. If you think, well, it doesn't work well at the moment, and now I'm going to integrate it, will it work well in the future? So I think it's good to get those challenges, and we need to make sure that we don't fool ourselves by ticking the box, but we also make sure we do get the performance that we want. So thank you.
For me, it raises the issue of cumulative impacts and the question of the pace of development. And what it does is it takes the question, it goes beyond the responsibility of an individual company and what they're doing in a specific location. It raises the question of how do we look at processes or requirements that especially in, there's a serious boom cycle that we're in right now in many aspects of the extractive resources and in many parts of the world. We've heard a number of different talks about it today. And when you get down to the question of those rights that will be violated when the boom impact of anywhere from 11 to 45 things taking place in one single location, we've got to think about how do we get the cumulative level of these issues addressed. And the Mackenzie Valley process that was presented earlier today by Bob Gibson had a strategic level assessment of the strategic sustainability questions, including the timing. Is it the right time? Are we prepared? What are the different scenarios for the pace and the speed at which this would take place? And a question of the other person presenting in Australia, there was a government effort to say they would manage the overall process in a coordinated way. So I think some of these impacts go beyond the realm of responsibility of the individual company. We haven't even begun to talk about that. But it's a huge challenge in this boom cycle that we're in right now, and I think it's a big issue.
And I think it's particularly amplified by, we've got all the easy stuff. In terms of resources, all the easy stuff we've already exploited. Where we're pushing into now is the type of companies that are pushing into DRC, which is arguably one of the most challenging social contexts, let alone going underwater, let alone going into national parks or protected areas, really remote, inaccessible areas, because that's where the resource now is that hasn't been exploited yet. It's more expensive to exploit, more complex, and that comes back to that. But hang on, in terms of the broader human rights issues, that's the responsibility of government. But government doesn't function. In Australia, government doesn't function in these remote regional areas, let alone in non-developed countries. So who then?
I'd like everybody in the panel actually to comment. I think that's a good one. So, Alan, do you want to?
Yeah, we're getting a little bit back to the hairy elephant in the room. That's what human rights does. I mean, it's a government issue, right? And if we look at the UN framework, there is a pillar for the state duty to protect. And in a way, if that pillar was taken seriously, none of us would be in this room today, as you rightly point out, Richard. So we're kind of providing a palliative to a dysfunctional situation, you could say. But I think when we move from social impact assessment to human rights impact assessment, it becomes very important to ask that question that Susan asks. Should this be done at a strategic level by a donor or the government? There are many human rights impacts that are going to be relevant countrywide, at least within the same sector. There's one legal system, maybe there are some provincial differences. There's one labor code. Why wouldn't you do it on a strategic level and actually do the attribution of what the state needs to do to plug the holes in its legal system? But that's also the kind of interaction that companies are paranoid of. If you do a human rights impact assessment and you do a proper baseline for it, what you're doing is essentially an assessment of the state's performance on human rights. Are you going to make that public as a company? So how do you actually have a dialogue with your host government on that? That's the real way of fixing the issues, but it's also, in many geographies, a recipe for disaster for many companies.
I think I wanted to add to that was what we're lacking here is time, and I think it's time for the engagement with government, time that companies or project, whether they're joint ventures, whatever, to set aside to understand this and have the space for the dialogue, space to come to the free, quick, the point of consent. And to echo what other people have been saying, we have this huge, especially in the minerals industry, we have this huge crunch at the moment. People are waiting for commodities to crash linked to the construction industry, and so at the moment I'm having kind of very interesting conversations with one client where they are thinking how much can they do something different, call material out on roads rather than, instead of waiting for the railway because they want to hit the market as quick as possible, and you just think about all the impacts linked to that. And trying to argue for time in the schedule is really, really hard, and that comes back to awareness amongst the people that are in control of the time, which often is the project managers.
No, I was just going to say that the question we've heard again and again in Australia is who owns time? Who owns it? And if you try to answer that, it's amazing. Who owns it?
Okay, so
I just wanted to make one comment. Back to the question of, in a sense, what are some of the screening criteria that need to be in place that should say we have to go from, this 80% that are where we're comfortable that we can cover the human rights issues and the other issues through a strong, robust, and well-supported social impact assessment. I think that government capacity and willingness to address their own human rights gaps is a critical one. And of course, the existence of conflict and post-conflict societies is another one. Guatemala is a significant number of years post, the peace process in the late 1990s. Almost nothing had been done to implement the commitments in the peace process. They'd signed every human rights agreement under the sun, had very, very low rating on the UN's own review process, the universal reviews, in terms of their actual fulfillment of those government responsibilities. So I think those are some quick screening pieces that say, obviously, if we're going to go into this country, we need to look much more thoroughly and much more deeper at the institutions that do or do not exist and the rights that are not protected by the state.
What I'm going to do is I'm going to take this question at the back, and then I've had a number of questions that were handed to me. So in the interest of time and where we're at with this discussion, I will start reading out some of those questions as well, because I think they all relate to a lot of the topics we've already been talking about. So would you like a microphone, or do you think you can speak loud enough?
Hi.
You sound like you can.
Hi, my name is Kelly with Benfield Hazard Research Center. That's much longer name. My area is disaster management, and a rights-based approach has become one of the mainstream issues in disaster risk management. Disaster risk management is not just relief, but preparing for disasters and recovering from disasters period after that. And oftentimes in disaster risk management, technological disasters are linked or in some way associated with extractive mining. Tailings dam collapses, mining that causes flooding downstream, et cetera, et cetera. So I was wondering whether in your work across the board, whether that's ever come in as a factor from the people you've talked to, and whether a rights-based approach to reducing disaster impact or managing disaster impact has ever played a role. And I'm asking this partly because I'm wondering whether there's two separate worlds talking about rights-based approaches or whether there's some commonality.
You know, we can pick someone, so Susan, off you go.
I'll just say really quickly, in one particular case, the lack of engagement around contingency planning that the company had done and their failure to engage the communities that were in direct risk was considered a rights issue. And it was linked.
You know, I'm not familiar with it in those terms, but I have a particular example of a large mining company that had a project in a Southeast Asian country, and the context was it was a very high incline with in a wet environment with large tailings dam, and it was one of the most seismic areas in the world. Those are human rights potential impacts. And I think the analysis that we gave, which was pretty obvious, frankly, that we had to get some engineering input.
Usually it is.
Seven or eight towns, not villages, towns, 28,000 people below the dam. You can engineer it till the cows come home, but not in that situation. And the company walked away from the deposit because of that. But I'd be interested in talking because I think they are different worlds. But
I'm sorry, they didn't take the tailings dam with them when they walked away.
So they didn't build it.
Oh,
Yeah, they didn't build it.
That's a great.
thank you.
I wasn't going to reply with a specific example, but I think that's where it's very useful to look at any of these issues or different elements that a company might be trying to manage and putting that rights-based approach to it, and immediately you can start to think about, well, what is the role of the business here, and what is the role of the government, and what do communities need to be prepared for that situation and start to manage those issues, and that's where I think this is really important in integration.
I had one small thing. I have no direct experience or example, but I imagine for communities, it would be the perception and the fear of a natural disaster, and that's definitely linked to human rights and social impact assessment. It's not just about an actual impact, it's the perception and fear and the psychological impacts on people. So I think there's a link. I'm not an expert or know much about disaster.
Yeah. I really have to agree on that. The fear stops people from acting. And fear, even if it's inaccurate, can be a human rights impact. It can be inaccurate, have erroneous fear, which I think would not be the kind of risk you're looking at. So that'd be a place where there'd be a distinction between the two. But it can be inaccurate fear, which can stop action.
Can I just check the question? Was the question those who have responsibility for decision making in terms of preventing disasters, are they using a human rights lens to understand what disasters they need to prevent? Was that the question?
No, I'm sorry, the question was well answered. The question was, in your work, looking, using human rights-based approach at looking at what would happen in extractive industries, has the issue of disasters come up and been, as has been pointed out in some cases, addressed? Yes. Because we see these events, the extractive industries, as a potential risk, and certainly one that evolves very quickly.
I think the answer to both is yes, and I think particularly in terms of for one example where I've had a lot of direct experience,
the cyanide code, the use of cyanide, and taking responsibility for the potential disaster of the cyanide spill through the whole route of transportation. I mean, the industry, I think, has really made a big effort to understand the potential disaster. I don't think, though, they're necessarily doing that because they're using a rights-based lens. So that's why I liked your question, because it got me thinking. Thank you.
Right, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to start with some, I'm going to start working through these questions that were handed to us from the previous session. So the first one is, other than using human rights language, what are the material differences, benefits between a human rights impact assessment and a comprehensive environmental social impact assessment based on IFC's performance standards? And part two, which situations, issues will require a human rights impact assessment? So who wants to give that a try?
Let me look part two. I'll pick the easy one. So when to use a human rights impact assessment? I think for me, when I think about rights for individuals, you have to look at how is their right being protected at the moment, and then under what circumstances may they be vulnerable or additionally vulnerable to the arrival of a project. So I put straight on my hit list if it's a post-conflict or it's a weak governance environment where the right to protect, the government's protection of their rights is not being fulfilled. I think the arrival of a project will only enhance the potential impact or the removal of their rights. So I would say that would be the circumstances that I would use as my sort of what is their current context and how more are they additionally vulnerable to the project because of that context. Therefore, should I be using a rights-based approach?
Sorry. I've got one now. Because when we were first asked to do one, it was in Australia, and I was almost like thinking, why? Why would you do a human rights impact assessment in the Australian context? Because of the assumptions you've spoken to. What we were completely taken aback with when we went through the process was that we were asking questions, for example, in terms of labour practices using international standards. And the fundamental assumption from the HR people we were engaging with, oh, but that's all okay. We comply with Australian law. But when we were doing engagement, stakeholder engagement, talking to a sample of employees confidentially, individually, and engaging with them, we started to see patterns and certain issues in terms of labour relations. When we fed it back, we were able to triangulate, we actually found that there was non-compliance with Australian law. Even though there was no intention, it was just a practice that changed, and a lot of sites in Australia fly in, fly out, so you lose institutional memory very quickly, and this is all it was. So, in terms of that work that we've done in the Australian context, we've been able to consistently, not all time, but pretty consistently, find areas for significant opportunity for improvement. Even though I would have agreed with you that your first answer is surely you're only going to do that in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I just wanted to offer that as, surprisingly, you can actually go through a human rights impact assessment and still gain value because we're asking questions from a different perspective.
Sorry. Okay. All right. And I think almost all the speakers addressed the question of what a human rights impact assessment gives you over and above performance standards kind of base. No? Okay. In my experience, the power of asking the question, and I would say what Richard is giving an example of, is the power of asking the question. What human rights gives you is asking all those questions that matter to people. Because the human rights movement grew up over those decades and centuries and millennia to try to ask that question. So what we're doing is borrowing the learning from the human rights movement to try to find out what matters. And in my experience, which again, I'm a consumer, I hire people to do human rights impact assessments for companies. Every time I've ever done it, we've learned helpful things that all the other studies did not find by asking those questions.
Yes, I think I would like to push expectations back a little bit, because our experience with human rights impact assessments is really poor. We had two waves. We had a wave around 2004, which was led from the head office, because that's where the expertise was, one person, who arranged human rights impact assessments in about 4 countries. And all of them are still sitting on the shelf gathering dust, because none of them was accepted by local management. So I would really advocate that a good social impact assessment, and I think I heard you say IFC standards, and I've read all of that, so bear with me, but I'm sure you have. Let's work towards implementing those human rights elements that can be slotted in around engagement, around making sure the screening scope is right. Because that's our only hope of implementing human rights in big organizations. Human rights rule is just not going to work as a routine assessment, because it's too labor intensive, you don't have the right skills at the local level, you always need consultants, and it's too expensive. And finally, worst of all, the results don't integrate. So integrate in normal management practices. So I would really turn the question around and say, what can we do in order to build as much as possible into social impact? And also, let's make sure we all understand what those elements are, so that when it comes to a challenge value, you're not doing a human rights impact assessment, but you can say, well, actually, I particularly pay attention to this, this, and this, and because of that, I do actually cover what we need to cover in these circumstances. And then we go to DOC, and maybe to other countries. But that should be the exception, not the rule.
So there's something about having a layer of sort of, as much as possible, do it internally, but having a layer of options that allows you to direct it down. And I guess that's what I'm thinking of in terms of if you do a human rights risk assessment. If that raises the fact that you've got significant risks, you may then ask for a deeper investigation whether a human rights impact assessment. Oh, sorry. However, I would say we've had that experience where a company's asked us to work with them to develop a self-assessment process that absolutely does slot in. In fact, that's happened now twice with 2 different companies where they said, no, it needs to retrofit if it's going to come alive. And the other question for me is I keep hearing about a comprehensive SIA. What is that? I was just wanting to explore that, because I did also hear maybe human rights impact assessment has something to offer to bring us closer to a comprehensive SIA. Because in our experience, I heard about the workshopping of the recommendations as the consultant. What we've actually moved to is actually co-developing the recommendations. It's actually not telling them what we think they need to do as a result of the impacts and how we've understood it. But particularly in the Australian context, we've had to find a solution where we can totally transfer the consultant's understanding from engaging with the community and understanding the impacts to those who are making the decisions, who are working day to day. So part of it's absolutely transfer, but also if they are co-developing the recommendations, then they're only more likely to work. So we don't have the doorstop issue where the report sits as a doorstop or it's a bookend. I don't handle it. It's like a talking stick, I can't get away from that.
Just a very brief comment on the co-developing. I like that thought, and Alan knows where this comes from. Our experience is that also deals with some of the legal concerns that our legal department have, or identifying issues that maybe should have been resolved and have caused legacy issues. Because if it's not a consultant that tells you that you do your own decisions and work with your own management plans, you do actually deal with some of that.
You've given me something to talk to legal counsel with, thank you.
Well, as a sociologist, I don't think that in most cases, if you do a really good job at an integrated, at the social impact assessment side and the environmental side is equally as strong and based on performance standards, I'm not sure in most cases that there is a gap, but it's for me a bit of a carrot and stick issue, and it has to do with the weak regulatory environment around social issues in many environments, and the weak performance of many companies. In the industry that I primarily work in is mining, but I know oil and gas is the same, so you have this discrepancy between the leaders, the innovators, those that are integrating and addressing these issues, and then you have those that aren't on board. So there's a fear factor associated with human rights for the clients that aren't good performers and aren't working on it, and that's, you know, in a real world of wanting performance overall to improve and the human rights and other social impacts to get better, there's a value to the international human rights legal framework that isn't in the social, at least the social component of SIAs.
Yes, I mean, partly by asking, could the person who posed that question please come to me afterwards, because that's exactly what I'm looking to answer. And I'm also struggling when I look at the performance standards. I'm also struggling to see where are the real gaps. Of course, you can say when you do a human rights-based impact assessment, it's a change of tone. You don't talk about stakeholders, you talk about rights holders and duty bearers. It's a big change of tone. So if you want to take it to that level, you can always find differences. And then impact assessments typically would look at relationships that you have with contractors, but they may not look very much at relationships you have with the government or your joint venture partners, or casting the net a little bit wider. Typically, some of the substance areas that would be left out are labor and security and revenue, which typically do not come into a social impact assessment, but which should come into a human rights impact assessment. So there are certainly some differences on the margins, but you know what I want to do is fix 80% of social impact assessment so that it does a decent human rights job. And in that sense, I think social impact assessment will have to change the way CSR is changing today. You can't talk about as a company what you do in CSR without putting a human rights baseline underneath it. And I think we'll be in the same area with social impact assessment 5 years from now. You couldn't have, you know, a social impact assessment report without actually referring to the human rights baseline that actually underpins those impacts. So I think we'll see the same trend there.
Transformation, great, excellent. Okay, so I've got a question. How do you get access to workers and facilities and avoid risks to whistleblowers and even to practitioners in highly competitive areas? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
How do you get access?
Can I have I'm happy to have a go. Because this really comes to the fore if you're going to do it internal versus external. I was in a mixed team a few weeks ago where we had exactly this conversation. So it was a mixed internal-external team. It wasn't directly in the context of a human rights impact assessment, but the internal people said, and the issue was around systematic sexual abuse. So what had happened was, as I'd done an interview, the woman had told me 2 weeks after I started with this mining operation, I was told if I wanted to keep my job, this senior manager would come and ask for sexual favours. If I want to keep my job in this operation, I need to provide that senior manager with these sexual favours. So as an external person, my first duty of care was to her. So I explained to her what the procedures were that were available for her to raise this, and she said, no, I don't want to use any of it, but you're external, which is why I'm trusting you with this. And I told her what my options were in terms of taking that forward. And at the end she chose for me, she just said, just the fact that I told you, that's why. Okay? So she asked me not to take it further. And when I raised this with the internal people, they said their first duty of care was actually to the company, not to that individual. And had they done that interview and she shared that with them, that their duty was to actually raise that because of the code of conduct of that company. They had a responsibility to whistleblow, to raise those if someone shared it with them. Now I suspect she wouldn't have shared that with someone else from that company. But I think just to bring that to life, I guess I've directly experienced that because it raises some interesting questions around how do we get the best information where we may have human rights issues with that domain of internal external. Sorry, that was probably taking the question somewhere else, but hopefully bringing
I think that pretty well nailed the context of it. I mean, I think once again it's around the complexities in this space that we start to encounter and those issues of duty of care and protecting those individuals as well. So I think that's very much accurate. I'm not sure whether it answers it, but I think it certainly throws up some of the complexities around that. So can you let me get through these and I'll remember you. And does anybody else want to respond to that?
Well, I would say that comes up, the kind of employee issues come up, problems with private security, where there's a serious problem, but it has to be anonymous. It would be the one exception to transparency in our report, where it does have to be confidential. And part of that is an ethos that the human rights assessment should not itself violate human rights.
Did you want to ask a question? Lisa?
The issue.
It's on.
You talked, Richard, about how obvious these human rights violations were when you went to places like DRC, and we talked about Papua New Guinea and other places. But in Boomtown, Western Australia, and your last question refers to competition for work, where I'm a reasonably civilised person, and I've observed what I would call infringements on human rights with people coming in highly qualified positions with 457s, who are scared to report bullying in the workplace because they need to keep their job for 2 years. And then I was also amused to hear that BHP's ordered 1 million human rights reports, or however many it was, knowing full well that you're no longer, and I don't mean to be flippant or trite, but at BHP in Perth you're not allowed to eat at your desk, you cannot wear blue jeans, you cannot...
Not allowed to meet with outsiders.
You're allowed to have 5 by 7 inch photograph one only at your desk. And in a competitive workplace employee environment, at what point would you consider they are violations of human rights? Given the context.
Good, and that's true about BHP as well. But just the audiences, 457 visa is a temporary work visa in Australia, so it's a very limited, restricted visa requirement that obviously people who come in on that visa don't have access to a lot of things that a resident does, just for a bit of context. So, who would like to respond to that comment?
Do you want me to?
Yes.
Hopefully I answered that previously when I said, I think Karen was saying, Catherine was saying human rights impact assessments are probably best done in the context of systemic or pervasive human rights abuses. I said, interestingly, that was the assumption I originally had, but they having done some in the Australian context, particularly in remote areas of Australia. In fact, we've got some major issues, which is no surprise in terms of relationships with Indigenous peoples wherever you are. But a human rights impact assessment well and truly surfaces those, as it does for labour relations. So even in a developed country context where you think you have everything ticked off because you are compliant with the law, it's fascinating when it comes to human rights, how the initial conversation around the Labor Party is, but we're a developed country, that will all be okay. But when you ask the question, it's amazing what does emerge. And I think that shows the power of what is due diligence, what Ruggies' original intent was, is it doesn't matter where you operate. There is power in asking the question. Thank you.
A little bit what I was going to say, but I was picturing me working in BHP Billiton with my one photograph on my desk. There's lots of stuff on my desk. Actually, I don't have a desk, so maybe I see when I come in the office in the morning, I have to see where is an empty place. But so I think companies have a whole toolkit of stuff that they need to apply. To make sure that their policies work and that the policies are also put into practice in culture and company values. So employee surveys and stuff, maybe this is the time to talk about grievance mechanisms and so on as well. which you can use to remedy things, but are much more interesting is the thermometer of how well the system really works. Just like we do in safety, we will near misses. But it's not because we sort of are at lots of people. It's because it gives you an indication of where we really go there. And I think human rights, that's good scope.
I think my question was more in that those roles of assumptions, because we live in the first world, so to speak, that we can rule over things very quickly in the name of occupational health and safety, because someone might slip on a lunchbox lid. Those are so quickly eroded in the face of boom times.
So, human rights impact assessment fundamentally challenges those assumptions.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to, I think it's coming to a point that's been made quite forcefully over there, is that, at the end of the day, we want to try and understand projects in enough depth so that rights aren't compromised and that these projects move forward. And so, in my ideal, I'd love it that we have a single tool. I'd love it that social impact assessment has the concepts of human rights and the lens of human rights within it, and so it just becomes standard. And so whether you're in Australia or the assumed good practice zones or the really obvious ones where you're going to trip up on more human rights concerns, you still have the same lens to apply it, and so you can dig deep, you can ask the questions. But I think a kind of really important thing to say is that social impact assessment only often happens when there's changes on the project, in terms of a new project is coming, or an expansion of the project, or the project maybe is closing. And so it's a tool in that context. And I think the due diligence, especially that was spoken on within the RUFI framework, and the risk assessment process that is ongoing is absolutely vital. And so, therefore, the integration of this lens into the company's risk assessment processes, so that it isn't a one-off that you look at and then if things change, so that you actually continuously, the project continuously learns, continuously improves, is absolutely vital.
I just want to build on the question that you put, so that I can build it into another question that can hopefully make Rita's list. I'm not saying it's not an infringement or a negative impact, but I'm saying how can we talk about magnitude of human rights impact? Do we need to talk about magnitude of human rights impact? I can tell you, human rights folks will say that's a violation against fundamental human rights principles. It's indivisible. You can choose. All things equally important. And then you get into the C-suite, and you need to make a cut somewhere between the red and the yellow. But how do we do that? And how would that be applied? So if that can make it onto your list.
Well, that was a perfect segue for my comment, which was there's a dimension that we aren't really, that I think needs to be brought out, which is that impact assessment, as we've practiced it, and not necessarily ideal, but what we're often talking about is mitigating impacts that can't be avoided. There's a fundamental shift in human rights, which is that or the other side is that I can compensate for a negative impact here by doing a positive impact over here. And those two concepts don't work when it comes to human rights, because you can't invest $1 million in social development projects and compensate for the fact that you've caused a loss of food security for an entire village of people who lost their land. So it's one thing to compensate those people and address their issues, but there's that whole concept of offsetting, thank you, sometimes I'm missing the terms, of offsetting or compensating doesn't work in the human rights realm, so that's, I think, an important distinction.
Okay, great. Wow.
It's a round table, that's why you're here. Actually, it doesn't seem like a round table. It seems much more like something where, can you help me? Can you make me this wrong? This is not a round table. This is something that looks like this. The audience and the round table, which is a symbol of power. Power. The male power. Thank you. maybe the transition for bringing human rights to the discussion table, it's to overcome this kind of power hierarchical pyramidal, which is this kind of pyramidal thing. We need really a round table. We need really to discuss eye on eye and really demands and hearts and feel what every tribe has to say. We are all one. Well, that's pretty much. Now let's just go on with the thing. Let me get my writings. Just a second.
Can we ask other questions?
Yes, I missed it. Yeah, that's what I was going to say. This woman, she said about what is human rights. I mean, we are in a crisis, historical, economic crisis, historical in the human time, and we will need to discuss what we need to be alive, to be living in the world with happiness, with a common ground that is sustainable for everyone. Maybe we need to conceptualize what is this common ground, what is this sustainability, what is human rights. And I'm really aware that if we are waiting for illuminated ones on the round tables of ONU or UN, actually, no, they are not bringing the solution. They will not. We need to labor it from the bottom up, because we need to have a social empowerment to overcome what this structural power that makes. So how are we to bring equality? How are we to bring? Actually, we're talking about this Congress energy. Energy is resource. Energy is matter. Energy is richness. Energy is development. It can be sustainable development. And how are we sharing this privately? We are staying with all this and exploiting on behalf of the others, of a great majority. So what we need to discuss is much more beyond what we are just on the superficial. We need to go beyond. It's power. It's about it's about the rights to have rights, which is much more than just like human rights. We need to discuss our rights. We have to have the room and the space for discuss our rights. And what I was going to say is that we have a great moment to do this. Environmental is making our awareness of where we are in the world right now. We're still waiting, human species in the world, and we are facing a dilemma that is, where are we going to? Just oh, okay, no, that's okay. I have lots to say, but that's okay. I think I made my point, and hopefully we can move together. Rio 2012, Rio de Janeiro, a great transformation perhaps, because we need a transformation of the system of powers. That's mostly one of the problems that we're facing. Thank you.
Thank you. That's very powerful points and comments that you've got there. I think human rights is about is about the power structures as well. So does anybody want to make a comment or respond to the comment?
We have a comment from the floor?
Yeah, absolutely.
Sorry to oblige. Yeah, I think I have a little bit of sympathy for the gentleman who just spoken. It may be better to try and open it into a round circle, otherwise we get slightly repetitive answers to the same questions. And there's a lot of experience in this room, I'm sure, and curiosity about how we can apply human rights principles. I work in social and environmental assessment and a lot of resettlement, indirectly social impact for development projects. So my concerns are in developing countries and Africa, and I'm glad we mentioned things like sexual exploitation, because these are absolutely everyday occurrences. It's not just to keep your job, but sometimes to get paid on certain jobs. I guess there's a slight bias towards oil and gas, which are big companies with certain reputations to keep. So perhaps I should limit my don't know whether we're supposed to just talk about oil and gas projects or mining projects. I'm amazed at the word that the trade unions has not come up as an issue. I mean, if I was doing a social development impact, I think I would want to comment on to what extent people are able to express themselves. I mean, what the gentleman said, human rights is one development indicator. I think the UN has development indicator, which includes having enough food to feed yourself, health, and things like that. And the ability to express yourself is another indicator. So human rights is not everything. It's part of one's well-being. And so I think it's surprising that we haven't been discussing to what extent are unions, syndicates able to stand up for people in certain countries. I would have thought in Australia you had certain unions to whom you can appeal, and ombudsmen and people like that. In other countries, these are not as effective. So I think I would like the group and the rest of the audience to comment on to what extent social impact assessment, human rights impacts should comment in those areas. And I think someone mentioned that there should be profiles of countries. We're doing environmental profiles of countries with human rights, strategic human rights. I can see it's a complicated issue. Yeah, we've had, environmental lawyers are new on projects in developing countries, and now we have human rights lawyers. This is interesting. Retaliation is something that we've mentioned. I'm just going through my list in case I don't get a chance to speak again. And I think was mentioned, expensive lawyers. I mean, I know how much I charge myself out there. And I'm aware also how much lawyers charge themselves out there. And I think they're about 5 times my rate as to what I know about UK lawyers. So I think that the gentleman from Shell put a bit of sort of reality into the discussion, that unless you do a lot of work, you're not going to, it could be very expensive to try to secure perhaps what cannot always be achieved. But we hope that the trade unions to some extent should be, reinforcing their capabilities would be an important angle. Thank you, I think I've said enough.
No, I think that was all very relevant points, and that's all true. Sorry. So I have to apologise for the logistics of the room. I mean, in the perfect world, yes, I would have preferred that we were literally in a round, but given the numbers of people, to make it as inclusive as possible, I tried by making the panel accessible, but point taken.
So I just want to say a quick remark on the trade unions. I think having looked across some of the human rights screening tools, most would have that as some sort of indicator. Are workers able to join the union of their choice, and are unions, in terms of the relation between unions and federations. So I think that's in there.
And is the union actually working on behalf of the employees? In some cases they don't. So it's not a black and white issue.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's good to go back actually to the concept of human rights impact assessment and to the concept of social impact assessment. Because I feel, listening to all your discussions, that there's also some confusion about what is a human rights impact assessment, what is human rights due diligence, what is human rights compliance assessment, and what is social impact assessment. And it seems you're talking also a lot about compliance assessments and all of this in the field of human rights. Social impact assessment, I feel, is a process which starts at the beginning of a project and perfectly actually before a project is developed. And what I feel when working in the field with social and environmental impact assessment is that actually most companies are not able to or have the resources to ensure that human rights impact assessment is conducted. So most companies, for example, working in agricultural field and infrastructure field, don't have the resources for a human rights impact assessment, and therefore it's very important to integrate human rights principles and human rights indicators and human rights goals and human rights processes in a social impact assessment process. And that is actually possible. It's a very much a learning process, but it is also possible. And I want to raise one case which I worked on recently in Laos. It was a case about land rights, land issues, and actually we integrated human rights principles in the social impact assessments which we conducted there. And the benefit was that we could talk about right holders and duty bearers, and we could actually bring different stakeholders at the table, including the government, and solving issues about land. And I think that was a very added value of this process of social impact assessment, which had human rights principles and objectives integrated.
My name is Ruben Clay. So I'm a social impact assessment person, and I'm passionate about social impact assessment. Many of the comments that are made about the difference between HRA and social impact assessment rely on some sort of understanding about what social impact assessment is. And when there's a perceived deficit or difference, I think it's often due to the failure of social impact assessment to have achieved what it ought to be, rather than a fundamental difference. And the problem is that HRA will fall into exactly the same situation. In the future, people won't be doing it properly either, and it will be called that. I was particularly interested in the comment that you made about one of the things that HRA does is to assert the right to have rights. Social impact assessment doesn't have a legal basis in many situations. It gets its authority from the concerns that are raised. HRIA gets its authority from a claim to a legal basis for these rights. The fear that I have is that into the future, the ability to establish the legal basis for those rights will be increasingly changed. At the moment, we're in a honeymoon period in HRA where various people are asserting that these things are rights, but they're not really being tested. Some of them clearly are, but when you expand into more and more of the social issues, potentially the authority to claim them as being rights it isn't so great. So I see social impact assessment as being the process of managing social issues. It's a dynamic process, a bit like an environmental management system where we're now going to encourage a social way of thinking to implement, and the HRA mechanism provides a good auditing and stop check. But the most important thing is that the HRA gives us the ability to the right to have rights. I'm particularly interested in the feedback on this discussion about what is the risk of legal challenges from the other side about whether or not these things, what you'd like to have as human rights really are human rights, and will there be a winding back on human rights?
That I very much resonate with what you're saying, that if CEOs were done properly, the issues that we talk about under the human rights umbrella would be addressed as well. I fully buy into that, and that's part of the integration idea that I think is emerging quite strongly from what I'm hearing here, and also from you. Just on the, I'll come back a little bit on the when would that be challenged from the other side? I think it's very important what's going on in the OECD space currently with the national contact points being revised and revamped in many OECD jurisdictions. And part of best practice there is actually that corporations can now challenge claims made by NGOs. in the media and get them into this kind of alternative dispute resolution process to actually challenge the claims being made that they have infringed human rights. So I think I haven't seen that taking place yet, but I think it will come in places like the UK, Netherlands, Norway, where the NCPs are most developed. I do think there are borderline issues around human rights where it becomes tricky to make, a legal case for it, especially on the economic, social, and cultural rights, where you much more have to measure against the baseline of are you actually decreasing or increasing enjoyment, and it will be quite difficult to make a legal argument around it. Whereas in the civil and political rights, it's perhaps I would say on Marina's question, just to go back to that, what is the difference between a compliance assessment and an impact assessment and a risk assessment? I don't know, it's a little bit like a name game, but a lot of companies hesitate from even having an external process in their assessment, and that's clear that doesn't qualify as an impact assessment. Then you need to call it something else, whatever that means. So whether that's a compliance assessment, to me a compliance assessment should be part of an impact assessment. You need to take a look at you need to conduct a management system review to have an idea of how you would be equipped to deal with things. I also wanted to address the trade union part. I think often trade unions fall between the cracks because labor is not addressed in forward-looking impact assessments because there are no workers. So, because the project doesn't exist yet. But that's not an excuse for not talking to the trade unions that are in the country and that have the information. And of course, trade unions come in many shapes and sizes, and some are for and by the workers, some are not for and by the workers. And I've met with a fair amount of trade unions, and they normally don't have a gender agenda. So when you ask them about gender issues, that's typically not on their radar screen. So of course you need to approach trade unions as well with proportion.
My name is Maria Cunha. I'm a social development specialist with the International Development Bank and also a lawyer, I must confess. And I guess with those two lenses, I'm listening to this debate, and I'm thinking that there's a lot of overlap between human rights impact assessment and social impact assessment. There should probably be more, but they're not the same thing, and I don't think you can integrate them completely because you can ask it's a question of timing and a question of framing. And when you do them and when you frame them, at least in practice now, it's a different thing. Now that could change and it could evolve, but social impact assessment right now is done as very much as EIA, as a pre-project or early project instrument. If it continues to be that, then it will not take care of compliance issues as the company moves along. However, I'm a firm believer that these instruments should be iterative. It's just that they're not in the current practice. If they were iterative, and if we continue to if we did a baseline and then did another impact assessment as we go along, then for all these issues, then we would have this iterative instrument that could take care of a lot of these things. I think that the other area where you don't have overlap is that there are cumulative effects, as Susan was saying, that they are outside the scope of what traditionally, again, the practice SIA and EIA have been used for, which is project and company activity assessment versus governance. So there's a big context out there that is carved out in the scoping that needs to be in SIA for it to be relevant to the types of things that we assess with it today that are not being covered. So again, if we take those instruments and put them together in a different context, we could achieve that. But if we try to subsume human rights impact assessment into SIA as practiced today, I don't think that that's doable, and we will lose in the process. I don't know if you have thoughts about that. I'm sorry to have made a statement rather than a question, but I would like to hear feedback.
Yeah. I now, when I commission a human rights impact assessment for a client, at the end of the process, pull out the SIA and the human rights impact assessment with the client. Because the client asks the same question a lot of you are asking. The success of this has been dramatic. The difference between the human rights impact assessment, which asks questions specifically about rights in rights language, is often informed by topics and research done by the SIA. But it asks a fundamentally different question, a rights-based question. The social impact assessment isn't designed to do that. It's not supposed to do that. It doesn't do that. So I think they're fundamentally different. Again, a good SIA is the greatest tool you can use to inform your analysis, to rely on that work done, and ideally to have input into the SIA so that the research is done in a way that's most usable. If I could also quickly address...
So I was just going to ask for a clarification.
Yeah.
Those SIAs and HRIA, within that relationship, is that SIA done in a voluntary context or a regulatory one? Because I'm wondering if there's a distinction here to be made about the SIA relationship to HRIA. If I think about our work, we've to date done nothing in a regulatory context. So we do, and it's all self-regulatory requirement. All our clients have requirements that every 3 to 5 years an SIA will be done. And that's the space that we work in. The relationship between the SIA and the human rights impact assessment, I'd suggest is actually quite close, because you're working in a voluntary space and you're able to push what you do with the SIA really far. So I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, I'd say both. Both contexts. Human rights impact assessments are still voluntary. That may not last. Regulation and law, as well as commitments like lender requirements, may... Yeah, what do you mean by voluntary? Corporations have complex things. The board says you do it. You have to do it. Yeah.
There was nothing voluntary about the amount of money.
Yeah.
The pension fund said, if you don't do it,
exactly. You have shareholder revolt. You have board committee. Your corporate social responsibility committee of your board of directors may order you to do it. A lot of things can cause it so that it's really not voluntary. And I think the trend is in that direction.
Okay, do we... I'm conscious of time. We have a couple of minutes, and what I'd like to use the opportunity for, unless somebody has a burning question or a comment, is to do a very, very quick wrap-up with every panel member if they want to make a very brief comment on feedback, thoughts, direction, something provocative, very quickly. So, Bert, can I start with you perhaps, or shall I?
You can start with me. I'm learning every minute. I never pretended to have the answer when I came in, but I think I found lots of friends and allies. So I'd like to continue this discussion outside the room and into the future.
Great.
And I would say stay tuned. It's an exciting time. It's a challenging time. There's going to be failures, but don't blame the whole movement for individual failures. I'm going to fail, so will others. It's a hard topic.
I'm not sure whether we are speaking to the converted today. If you have to repeat this session in the next conference, if you look at today's program and the program for these days, what is the most appropriate session to not speak to the converted in and to be challenged by practitioners who are not human rights converted yet? I think that for me would be an interesting thing to come back to.
I don't have much extra, just to say thank you. I think as everyone was doing, we're kind of at the beginning of this journey. So for me, one gap is I really don't know a comprehensive ESIA, what it is and where the gaps are, or how we can work together using it as a baseline. So I think if we could crack that, and then also ourselves continue this conversation. We talk so much about stakeholder engagement, but how between practices of SIA and HRIA and among practitioners and companies can we work together? It's a challenging topic, and I think we need everyone's ideas to find for solutions.
I think that is a question, I guess I'm agreeing with me, and we heard in the panel presentations about looking across all rights, or then prioritizing on rights given the vast scope. And also we've talked a lot about integration and to make sure that the results from the impact assessments linked to the risk registers. But I guess the most uncomfortable question is what are those thresholds, and how do you determine where those risks are if we are talking about human rights and
Just go back to what I said earlier, and that is, I don't mind which way we go, as long as it's the way that's going to have the maximum positive impact. Does that make sense? Yeah? Let's change things for better, whichever way.
I had a really good idea and it went straight out of my head. So I think I'll just say that this has been incredibly exciting because, I do remember what I was going to say. There's a maturation process that needs to take place. We have very few examples. We don't have a collective body of experience to draw from. I can sit down today and say, over 15 years I know that the anticipated impacts of a mine development on X kind of local community or town will be, and enumerate them from experience. We need to build up that body of experience. It's not going to happen unless we can share more of the experience, of what was anticipated in terms of human rights impacts and what actually took place, the role of intervention. But we need more work. But I think we all can be part of that maturing of the discussion and the area of work.
I think most people have said what I wanted to say. I'm sorry, I better cop out. But no, it's really important, the sharing, because it's a process and evolution. We're all learning on every single instance that we do an assessment, due diligence, or an impact assessment in all various types. And so if we can share that, so we can work out between social impact assessment and human rights, where it can overlap, where it can complement, where there has to be a separation. I think the other thing that I take away from this, and I've really enjoyed, learned a lot from this discussion, but the other point was, it's gone from my head, is about how we engage with corporates. It's quite telling that we only have one representative, including you or two with Rita, from a corporate here on the panel. And I think the engagement and the growing awareness amongst corporates, amongst governments, will be absolutely instrumental in how this goes forward.
So thank you very much. One last announcement before.
I see the word meaningful grievance mechanisms. That's what the point of overlap. Sorry. As I work for the international projects at World Bank and whatever, DIFID and Asian Development Bank projects. And the one area that is emphasizing that is that there should be a grievance mechanism, whether it's for the resettlement or for the employees on a construction project. And that's certainly a way that people like yourselves can beef up and make sure that grievance mechanisms are meaningful and perhaps extend beyond the areas where they are intended to extend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Just on to that, we've got one last announcement.
I'll just announce that Diana Kemp and Frank Banks. So Diana Kemp's from the Centre for Social Responsibility in Mining, that's been mentioned a number of times here on the University. She and I are guest editing a special issue of IAIA, which is going to be on this topic of human rights and impact assessment. Now, we have invited a number of people specifically to contribute to that, but if anybody had a paper that they were working on and would like to contribute it to the process of the refereeing process for that special issue, then they are welcome to speak to me about that. The papers will be needed very quickly though, and the special issue is intended to be published in the middle of next year, so please look out for that.
Well, with that, thank you very much.